It was February 1990 in Florida, a time and place where life seemed serene and ordinary. Terri Schiavo was a young woman living a seemingly ordinary life. She was married to Michael Schiavo, but their lives took an unexpected turn in February 1990. Terri experienced a sudden and unexplained medical crisis. This event would change the course of their lives forever. What happened to Terri? Why did this crisis occur? How would her family cope with the unfolding tragedy? Her case would captivate the nation and ignite fierce debates about life, death, and the very essence of human consciousness. The world watched as the tragedy of Terri Schiavo's story unfolded. This is the story of Terri Schiavo, a woman trapped in the shadows of her own existence. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth stories and hit the bell icon to stay updated. February 25, 1990 began like any other day for Terri Schiavo, but in the early hours of the morning, something went terribly wrong. Her husband, Michael, awoke to find her collapsed on the floor of their home. He immediately called for help, desperately hoping for a miracle as paramedics rushed Terri to the hospital. The medical team worked tirelessly to stabilize Terri, but the cause of her collapse remained a mystery. She was unresponsive, her brain deprived of oxygen for a crucial period. Days turned into weeks as Terri lay in a hospital bed, her fate hanging precariously in the balance. Doctors conducted countless tests, searching for answers in a labyrinth of medical data. What had caused this young woman, seemingly in good health, to collapse so suddenly? The medical community was baffled. But as time wore on, the grim reality of Terri's condition began to set in. The medical diagnosis came like a crushing blow to Terri Schiavo's family persistent vegetative state. It was a term that carried with it a sense of finality, a sentence to a life devoid of consciousness and meaningful interaction with the world. Terri's body was alive, kept functioning by machines and the tireless efforts of medical professionals, but her mind remained lost in a seemingly unreachable abyss. A persistent vegetative state, the doctors explained, meant that Terri had lost the higher functions of her brain, the parts responsible for awareness, thought, and purposeful movement. She might exhibit reflexive responses, like opening her eyes or making sounds, but these were not indications of conscious thought or feeling. They were merely the echoes of a mind that was no longer present. The diagnosis was met with a mixture of disbelief, anger, and profound sadness. How could this be happening to Terri, a young woman full of life just a short time ago? The family struggled to accept the prognosis, but as the weeks turned into months and the months into years, the reality of Terri's condition became impossible to ignore. She remained trapped in this twilight zone of existence, her body a prisoner of its own biology. Michael Schiavo, Terri's husband, bore the weight of the diagnosis with a heavy heart. He had been there that fateful February morning, had witnessed her collapse, and had clung to hope just as fiercely as any family member. He visited Terri faithfully, talking to her, holding her hand, and praying for a miracle. But as time wore on and the reality of her condition settled in, Michael began to arrive at a heartbreaking conclusion. He believed that Terri would not want to live like this, tethered to machines, her body kept alive artificially while her mind remained lost in the abyss of a persistent vegetative state. He recalled conversations they had had, whispers of a future they had dreamed of together, a future that would never come to pass. And in those memories, in the echoes of their shared hopes and dreams, Michael found a painful truth. He believed that Terri would choose dignity in death over a life devoid of meaning, a life sustained by machines and medical interventions that offered no hope of recovery. It was a decision born of love, a love that sought to honor Terri's wishes and spare her from a fate she would have found unbearable. And so, Michael began a long and arduous legal battle, fighting for the right to let his wife go. Section 5. A family divided, the battle for Terri's fate. The Schiavo family found themselves irrevocably fractured, split by differing interpretations of love, faith, and what constituted a life worth living. On one side stood Michael, Terri's husband, convinced that he was honouring her wishes by seeking to remove her from life support. On the other side stood Terri's parents, Bob and Mary Schindler, clinging fiercely to the belief that their daughter was still present, that she deserved every chance to recover, however slim those chances might be. The Schindlers refused to accept the diagnosis of a persistent vegetative state, holding on to glimmers of hope, interpreting every fleeting movement, every reflexive response, as a sign that Terri was still in there, fighting to break free. They argued that Michael was motivated by selfish desires, that he was eager to move on with his life and had given up on their daughter too soon. The battle lines were drawn, and the case of Terri Schiavo became a legal and media maelstrom. Each side hired lawyers, filed lawsuits, and made their case in the court of public opinion. The media seized upon the story, portraying it as a heart-wrenching right-to-die case, a family torn apart by grief and conflicting beliefs. The nation watched as the Schiavo family's private tragedy played out on a public stage. Section 1. The Enigma of Consciousness, Understanding Persistent Vegetative State. The medical diagnosis at the heart of the Terri Schiavo case, persistent vegetative state, is a deeply unsettling condition. It occupies a nebulous space between life and death, challenging our fundamental understanding of what it means to be human. PVS patients are not comatose. They exhibit sleep-wake cycles. Their eyes may open and close, and they may even grimace, groan, or make other seemingly purposeful movements. However, these actions lack the hallmark of conscious awareness. Imagine a house with all its lights on, yet devoid of any inhabitants. This is akin to the brain in a PVS state. The lower brain functions, responsible for autonomic processes like breathing and heartbeat, continue to operate, maintaining the body's physical existence. However, the higher cortical functions, the seat of consciousness, thought, and purposeful interaction with the world, are absent. This lack of awareness is the defining characteristic of PVS, distinguishing it from other disorders of consciousness. Section 2. The Silent Epidemic. Statistics and prevalence of PVS. Persistent vegetative state, while relatively rare, is not an isolated medical phenomenon. It represents a silent epidemic affecting thousands of individuals across the globe, often as a result of traumatic brain injury, severe oxygen deprivation, or neurological illness. While precise statistics are difficult to obtain, estimates suggest that thousands of individuals in the United States alone live in a PVS, their families grappling with the emotional, financial, and ethical complexities of their care. The causes of PVS are as varied as the individuals it affects. Traumatic brain injury, often resulting from car accidents, falls, or acts of violence, can cause widespread damage to the brain, disrupting the delicate connections that underpin consciousness. Severe oxygen deprivation, which can occur during cardiac arrest, near-drowning incidents, or drug overdoses, can also lead to PVS by starving the brain of the oxygen it needs to function. Neurological illnesses such as stroke, brain tumors, and certain infections can also trigger PVS by damaging critical brain regions or disrupting the brain's delicate chemical balance. In some cases, PVS may arise as a complication of surgery or other medical procedures, highlighting the inherent risks associated with even routine medical interventions. The impact of PVS extends far beyond the individual patient, rippling outward to affect families, caregivers, and the healthcare system as a whole. Section 3. a window into the brain diagnostic tools and challenges. Diagnosing persistent vegetative state is a complex and nuanced process, relying on a combination of clinical observations, neurological examinations, and specialized brain imaging techniques. Doctors must carefully assess the patient's responsiveness, looking for signs of awareness, purposeful movement, and interaction with the environment. This assessment can be challenging, as PVS patients may exhibit reflexive movements such as grimacing, groaning, or opening their eyes that can be easily misinterpreted as signs of consciousness. Neurological examinations such as assessing pupil reflexes, eye movements, and motor responses provide further clues about the extent of brain damage and the likelihood of recovery. However, these examinations alone cannot definitively diagnose PVS, as they cannot directly measure conscious awareness. Brain imaging techniques such as electroencephalography or EEG and functional magnetic resonance imaging or fMRI offer a more direct window into brain activity, allowing doctors to assess the level of cortical function and identify areas of damage. EEG measures electrical activity in the brain, while fMRI detects changes in blood flow, providing insights into which brain regions are active during specific tasks or stimuli. However, even these sophisticated tools have limitations. EEG patterns in PVS patients can be variable, and the presence or absence of certain brain waves does not always correlate with conscious awareness. Section 4. The neurological battlefield. Assessing the damage in Terri's case. In Terri Schiavo's case, doctors faced the daunting task of deciphering the extent of her brain injury and determining whether any glimmer of consciousness remained. The initial event, a cardiac arrest leading to prolonged oxygen deprivation, had starved her brain of the vital oxygen it needed to function, setting off a cascade of cellular damage. The lack of oxygen had caused widespread neuronal death, particularly in the cortex, the outermost layer of the brain responsible for higher cognitive functions. Imaging studies revealed a stark picture of the neurological battlefield within Terri's skull. Her cerebral cortex, once a bustling network of neuronal connections, appeared shrunken and atrophied, its once intricate folds replaced by fluid-filled spaces. The damage was particularly pronounced in the frontal lobes, responsible for planning, decision-making, and personality, and the parietal lobes, involved in sensory processing and spatial awareness. EEGs showed a persistent pattern of slow-wave activity, indicative of severely impaired cortical function. These findings, combined with her lack of responsiveness to external stimuli and her inability to follow commands or engage in meaningful communication, led doctors to the diagnosis of persistent vegetative state. The medical consensus was that Terri's brain injury was both severe and irreversible. Section 5. Glimmer of hope or cruel illusion. The debate over misdiagnosis. The diagnosis of persistent vegetative state, while often accurate, is not without its critics. Some argue that misdiagnosis is a significant problem, with some patients labeled as PVS actually harboring flickers of consciousness that go undetected by current diagnostic tools. This concern is fueled by anecdotal stories of patients who have awakened from PVS after years of seeming unawareness, challenging the medical community's understanding of this complex condition. The possibility of misdiagnosis, however remote, strikes at the heart of the ethical debate surrounding PVS. If even a small percentage of patients diagnosed with PVS are actually conscious, even minimally so, then decisions about their care take on a new urgency and moral weight. The withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment, such as artificial nutrition and hydration, from a misdiagnosed patient would constitute a grave injustice. This concern is further heightened by the limitations of current diagnostic tools. While EEG and fMRI can provide valuable insights into brain activity, they cannot definitively measure subjective experience or conscious awareness. These tools provide a window into the brain's electrical and metabolic activity, but cannot fully capture the complexity of human consciousness. Families often misinterpret reflexive movements in PVS patients as signs of awareness. Smiles, groans, and hand grasps can seem meaningful but are not conscious actions. Misinterpretation can prolong grief and complicate decisions. Clear, compassionate communication from medical professionals is essential. The prognosis for patients in a persistent vegetative state is generally poor, especially if it persists beyond a certain time frame. The longer a patient remains in a PVS, the less likely they are to experience significant recovery. Rare cases of recovery often involve misdiagnosis or transition to a minimally conscious state. The first few months after brain injury are critical for potential recovery. Intensive rehabilitation may help stimulate neural pathways. Over time, the focus shifts from cure to comfort and dignity. As the legal and ethical battle over Terri Schiavo's fate raged on, medical experts found themselves thrust into the spotlight, their opinions sought after and scrutinized by both sides of the debate. While there was general agreement that Terri met the diagnostic criteria for persistent vegetative state, opinions differed on the extent of her brain damage, the potential for recovery, and the interpretation of her occasional movements and vocalizations. Doctors who examined Terri on behalf of her husband, Michael Schiavo, generally supported the diagnosis of PVS and testified that her brain injury was irreversible. They pointed to the extensive damage to her cortex, the lack of any meaningful responses to stimuli, and the absence of any signs of conscious awareness. They argued that her movements and vocalizations were reflexive, stemming from preserved lower brain functions, and did not indicate any level of conscious thought or interaction with her environment. On the other hand, doctors consulted by Terri's parents, Bob and Mary Schindler, offered a more optimistic view, suggesting that she might be in a minimally conscious state characterized by intermittent signs of awareness. They pointed to occasional movements that they interpreted as responses to stimuli, such as tracking objects with her eyes or seeming to smile at familiar faces. They also highlighted the lack of a definitive test for consciousness, arguing that existing diagnostic tools might not be sensitive enough to detect subtle signs of awareness in patients with severe brain injury. This divergence of medical opinion, while not uncommon in complex medical cases, fueled the already heated debate surrounding Terri's fate. It underscored the limitations of current medical knowledge and diagnostic tools, leaving room for interpretation and fueling the fire of hope for those desperate for a miracle. Ultimately, the courts were left to grapple with these competing medical perspectives, weighing the evidence and making life or death decisions based on the best available information, even in the face of uncertainty. As the legal and ethical battle over Terri Schiavo's fate raged on, medical experts found themselves thrust into the spotlight, their opinions sought after and scrutinized by both sides of the debate. While there was general agreement that Terri met the diagnostic criteria for persistent vegetative state, opinions differed on the extent of her brain damage, the potential for recovery, and the interpretation of her occasional movements and vocalizations. Doctors who examined Terri on behalf of her husband, Michael Schiavo, generally supported the diagnosis of PVS and testified that her brain injury was irreversible. They pointed to the extensive damage to her cortex, the lack of any meaningful responses to stimuli, and the absence of any signs of conscious awareness. They argued that her movements and vocalizations were reflexive, stemming from preserved lower brain functions, and did not indicate any level of conscious thought or interaction with her environment. On the other hand, doctors consulted by Terri's parents, Bob and Mary Schindler, offered a more optimistic view, suggesting that she might be in a minimally conscious state characterized by intermittent signs of awareness. They pointed to occasional movements that they interpreted as responses to stimuli, such as tracking objects with her eyes or seeming to smile at familiar faces. They also highlighted the lack of a definitive test for consciousness, arguing that existing diagnostic tools might not be sensitive enough to detect subtle signs of awareness in patients with severe brain injury. This divergence of medical opinion, while not uncommon in complex medical cases, fueled the already heated debate surrounding Terri's fate. It underscored the limitations of current medical knowledge and diagnostic tools, leaving room for interpretation and fueling the fire of hope for those desperate for a miracle. Ultimately, the courts were left to grapple with these competing medical perspectives, weighing the evidence and making life or death decisions based on the best available information, even in the face of uncertainty. As the legal and ethical battle over Terri Schiavo's fate raged on, medical experts found themselves thrust into the spotlight, their opinions sought after and scrutinized by both sides of the debate. While there was general agreement that Terri met the diagnostic criteria for persistent vegetative state, opinions differed on the extent of her brain damage, the potential for recovery, and the interpretation of her occasional movements and vocalizations. Doctors who examined Terri on behalf of her husband, Michael Schiavo, generally supported the diagnosis of PVS and testified that her brain injury was irreversible. They pointed to the extensive damage to her cortex, the lack of any meaningful responses to stimuli, and the absence of any signs of conscious awareness. They argued that her movements and vocalizations were reflexive, stemming from preserved lower brain functions, and did not indicate any level of conscious thought or interaction with her environment. On the other hand, doctors consulted by Terri's parents, Bob and Mary Schindler, offered a more optimistic view, suggesting that she might be in a minimally conscious state characterized by intermittent signs of awareness. They pointed to occasional movements that they interpreted as responses to stimuli, such as tracking objects with her eyes or seeming to smile at familiar faces. They also highlighted the lack of a definitive test for consciousness, arguing that existing diagnostic tools might not be sensitive enough to detect subtle signs of awareness in patients with severe brain injury. This divergence of medical opinion, while not uncommon in complex medical cases, fueled the already heated debate surrounding Terri's fate. It underscored the limitations of current medical knowledge and diagnostic tools, leaving room for interpretation and fueling the fire of hope for those desperate for a miracle. Ultimately, the courts were left to grapple with these competing medical perspectives, weighing the evidence and making life or death decisions based on the best available information, even in the face of uncertainty. "1998 marked a turning point in the case of Terri Schiavo, transforming a private family tragedy into a public legal battle. After 8 long years of caring for his wife, believing her to be in a persistent vegetative state with no hope of recovery, Michael Schiavo made a heart-wrenching decision. He filed a legal petition to have Terri's feeding tube removed, effectively allowing her to die. Michael's petition sent shockwaves through the Schiavo family. While he maintained that his decision was driven by love, a desire to honor what he believed were Terri's wishes, her parents, Bob and Mary Schindler, were outraged. They viewed his actions as a betrayal, a violation of their daughter's right to life. A deep and bitter chasm erupted between the two sides, setting the stage for a protracted legal battle that would captivate the nation. The Schindlers vehemently contested Michael's petition, arguing that Terri was not in a persistent vegetative state, but rather a minimally conscious state. They clung to the belief that she responded to their presence, that her smiles and movements were signs of awareness, of a spirit fighting to break free from her silent prison. They were determined to fight for their daughter's life, to exhaust every legal avenue, no matter the cost. The legal battle began in the Pinellas County Circuit Court, where Michael's petition was heard. The court proceedings were emotionally charged, with both sides presenting medical experts, personal testimonies, and impassioned pleas for their version of justice for Terri. It was a clash of love and grief, of differing interpretations of medical evidence and what constituted a life worth living. In 1998, the Pinellas County Circuit Court ruled in favor of Michael Schiavo, recognizing him as Terri's legal guardian. This decision devastated the Schindlers, stripping them of their say in their daughter's fate. They accused Michael of misrepresenting Terri's wishes and vowed to appeal. This court victory was only the beginning of a long legal journey. The battle for Terri's fate soon escalated to a national stage. The legal battle over Terri Schiavo's fate reached a fever pitch in 2001 when, acting on the court's earlier ruling, Michael Schiavo authorized the removal of her feeding tube. The nation watched, transfixed, as the drama unfolded. A stark and deeply personal conflict played out on the public stage. For those who believed that Terri should be allowed to die with dignity, it was a long-awaited moment of compassion, a recognition of her right to be free from the shackles of a life devoid of meaning. For the Schindlers and their supporters, it was an act of unimaginable cruelty, a death sentence for a daughter they believed could still experience life and perhaps even recover. They rallied public support, organizing protests outside the hospice where Terri resided, their cries for justice echoing in the hearts of those who shared their belief in the sanctity of life. The removal of Terri's feeding tube sparked a firestorm of controversy, igniting a national debate about end-of-life care, the role of government in personal medical decisions, and the delicate balance between individual rights and societal values. Religious groups weighed in, with the Catholic Church in particular condemning the removal of Terri's feeding tube as a form of euthanasia. Just 6 days after the removal of her feeding tube, a glimmer of hope emerged for the Schindlers. An appeals court ruled that the initial trial court had not properly established Terri's wishes regarding life-prolonging measures. The feeding tube was reinserted, giving the Schindlers a temporary victory and breathing new life into their fight to keep their daughter alive. The case of Terri Schiavo, once confined to the realm of family courts and legal briefs, took a dramatic turn in 2003 when it became entangled in the world of politics. Jeb Bush, then governor of Florida, and his brother, President George W. Bush, both vocal opponents of euthanasia, took a keen interest in the case, aligning themselves with the Schindlers and their fight to keep Terri alive. In an unprecedented move that ignited a firestorm of controversy, Governor Bush pushed through Terri's law, a hastily crafted piece of legislation granting him the authority to intervene in the Schiavo case. Armed with this new law, Governor Bush ordered the reinsertion of Terri's feeding tube, overturning previous court rulings and thrusting the state government squarely into the middle of a deeply personal family tragedy. Terri's law was met with swift condemnation by legal scholars, medical ethicists, and civil liberties groups who decried it as a blatant violation of the separation of powers and an infringement on the judiciary's independence. They argued that the law set a dangerous precedent, allowing politicians to interfere in private medical decisions and undermine the rule of law. The Schindlers, however, hailed Terri's law as a victory for their daughter, a testament to the power of faith and perseverance in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. They believed that Governor Bush's intervention offered Terri a lifeline, a chance to defy the medical odds and perhaps even regain some measure of awareness. The legal battle over Terri Schiavo's fate reached a critical juncture in 2004 when the Florida Supreme Court, the state's highest court, issued a landmark ruling. In a 6-1 decision, the court struck down Terri's law, declaring it unconstitutional and a violation of the separation of powers. This ruling was a resounding victory for Michael Schiavo and a significant setback for the Schindlers and their political allies. The court's decision reaffirmed the fundamental principle of judicial independence, upholding the judiciary's role as the final arbiter of legal disputes, free from political interference. The justices found that Governor Bush's intervention in the Schiavo case, while perhaps well-intentioned, had crossed a constitutional line, usurping the role of the courts and undermining the delicate balance of power within the government. The court's ruling sent a clear message that political expediency could not trump the rule of law, even in the most emotionally charged and morally complex cases. It served as a powerful reminder that the courts are not swayed by public opinion or political pressure, but rather by the Constitution and the legal principles it enshrines. The Schindlers, while disappointed by the ruling, refused to give up their fight for their daughter's life. They continued to pursue every legal avenue, filing appeals in federal courts and seeking intervention from Congress. Their unwavering determination, fueled by love and faith, kept the case alive in the public consciousness and ignited a national debate about the limits of government power and the sanctity of life. The Terri Schiavo case ignited a national debate on end-of-life care, individual rights, and the sanctity of life. Public opinion was sharply divided, with passionate voices on both sides. Supporters of Michael Schiavo emphasized personal autonomy and avoiding prolonged suffering. They stressed the importance of respecting advance directives. The Schindlers and their supporters argued for the sanctity of life and protecting the vulnerable. They viewed removing the feeding tube as a violation of Terri's right to life. In a highly unusual move that underscored the political firestorm surrounding the Terri Schiavo case, the United States Congress entered the fray in March 2005. At the urging of the Schindlers and their supporters, both the House of Representatives and the Senate passed a bill granting Terri's parents the right to challenge the removal of her feeding tube in federal court. President George W. Bush, who had publicly expressed support for the Schindlers, signed the bill into law, setting the stage for yet another round of legal battles. The bill passed with bipartisan support, but amidst fierce opposition from civil liberties groups and advocates for the separation of powers, was a testament to the extraordinary public attention and political pressure surrounding the case. The congressional intervention, while unprecedented in a right-to-die case, ultimately proved futile. Federal courts, including the Supreme Court, declined to overturn the Florida Supreme Court's ruling, upholding the principle of judicial independence and refusing to interfere in what they considered a matter of state law. The congressional action, while ultimately unsuccessful in changing the course of the case, highlighted the deep divisions within American society over the issue of end-of-life care. It raised profound questions about the role of government in personal medical decisions, the limits of federal power, and the delicate balance between protecting individual rights and upholding societal values. The Schiavo case, once a private family tragedy, had become a national referendum on the meaning of life, the power of faith, and the limits of law in a society grappling with complex moral dilemmas. On March 18, 2005, after 14 years of legal battles, Terri Schiavo's feeding tube was removed for the final time. Her death, 13 days later, marked the end of a long ordeal and a turning point in the national conversation about end-of-life care. The case became a focal point for protests, vigils, and debates, highlighting deep divisions within American society. Terri's death reignited the debate over the right to die and the role of government in personal medical decisions. The Schiavo case remains a cautionary tale about the potential for legal battles to consume families and divide communities. The Terri Schiavo case ignited a debate on the right to die, autonomy, and the sanctity of life. Advocates for autonomy argued for self-determination, while opponents emphasized the inherent value of all life. The case remains a pivotal point in discussions on medical ethics and personal rights. Section 2, a question of guardianship, spousal rights versus parental claims. The Terri Schiavo case highlighted a bitter dispute over guardianship, pitting her husband, Michael Schiavo, against her parents, Bob and Mary Schindler. This clash raised profound ethical questions about spousal rights versus parental claims, especially when a patient's wishes are unclear. Traditionally, spouses hold significant legal weight in medical decision-making for incapacitated individuals. This recognition stems from the unique bond of marriage and the presumption that spouses understand each other's values and wishes. Section 3, Shades of Grey, defining consciousness and the persistent vegetative state. The ethical quagmire surrounding Terri Schiavo's case was deepened by her persistent vegetative state. PVS challenges our definition of consciousness, raising profound questions about life. Individuals in a PVS are not dead. Their bodies are kept alive with medical technology. They may exhibit sleep-wake cycles and track objects. These signs can be misleading, complicating decisions. PVS patients lack conscious awareness. They cannot experience the world or communicate. They exist in a twilight zone of biological function. The Schiavo case exposed the limitations of medical knowledge. This uncertainty fueled the ethical firestorm. Opponents clung to the possibility of consciousness. Her movements were seen as signs of a mind fighting to break free. Section 4. The role of religion, faith, morality, and end-of-life decisions. The Terri Schiavo case drew in religious voices, shaping public debate and influencing the political landscape. It highlighted the influence of faith on end-of-life decisions and the potential for conflict with secular law. For many, life is sacred from conception to natural death, opposing actions like euthanasia. The Schiavo case sparked a national conversation about religion's role in public life and individual rights. Section 5. A slippery slope, euthanasia fears, and the value of life. The Terri Schiavo case ignited fears of a slippery slope where removing life-sustaining treatment could lead to more troubling actions. Rooted in religious beliefs and respect for life, these fears shaped public debate. The spectre of euthanasia loomed large, raising concerns about protecting vulnerable individuals. They feared removing Terri's feeding tube would erode legal and ethical barriers. Accepting some lives as not worth living could set dangerous precedents. The slippery slope argument often relies on worst-case thinking. The Schiavo case's unique circumstances resist generalizations. It highlights the need for ethical reflection and open conversations about end-of-life care. Section 1. Media frenzy. The Schiavo case becomes a national obsession. The Terri Schiavo case, with its wrenching ethical dilemmas, clashing family loyalties, and life-and-death stakes, proved irresistible to the media. What began as a local family tragedy in Florida quickly morphed into a national obsession, dominating headlines, captivating cable news channels, and fueling countless hours of talk radio debates. The case became a 24/7 media spectacle, its every twist and turn dissected, analyzed, and sensationalized for a public hungry for the latest developments. The media frenzy surrounding the Schiavo case was fueled by several factors. First, the case tapped into deep-seated societal anxieties about the right to die, the role of government in personal medical decisions, and the limits of technology in prolonging life. The case offered no easy answers, forcing Americans to confront uncomfortable truths about mortality, family conflict, and the complexities of end-of-life care. Second, the Schiavo case had all the elements of a compelling human drama: a young woman trapped in a persistent vegetative state, a husband battling her parents for control of her fate, and a cast of supporting characters, including lawyers, medical experts, and religious figures, all vying for influence and public attention. The case was tailor-made for a media landscape increasingly driven by personality-driven narratives and emotional appeals. Third, the rise of cable news, with its 24-hour news cycle and constant need for fresh content, created a perfect storm for the Schiavo case to explode into a national obsession. The case provided an endless stream of legal filings, court hearings, protests, and press conferences, all fodder for a media machine hungry for dramatic footage and sensationalized headlines. Section 2. Divisive coverage shaping public opinion and fueling the firestorm. The media coverage of the Schiavo case was far from objective or dispassionate. News outlets framed the story through ideological lenses, shaping public opinion and fueling debate. Conservative media portrayed Michael Schiavo as a villain while highlighting the Schindler's love and religious convictions. Liberal media struggled to counter the Schindler's emotional pleas. Media polarization reflected and exacerbated societal divisions. The media's focus on conflict overshadowed nuanced ethical and legal issues. The Schiavo case raises questions about journalistic responsibilities in covering complex stories. Section 3. The Power of Images, Terri Schiavo, and the Politics of Representation. The media coverage of the Terri Schiavo case was notable for its use of powerful and often contested imagery. Images of Terri in her hospice bed shaped public perceptions of her condition and the moral stakes of the case. Supporters of Michael Schiavo saw these images as a reminder of her devastating condition. They believed allowing her to die with dignity was compassionate. The Schindlers saw the images as misleading and exploitative. They argued the media failed to capture moments when Terri seemed responsive. They accused the media of selectively editing footage to fit a narrative. The battle over Terri Schiavo's image highlights the power of visual media. It underscores the importance of media literacy in evaluating images and narratives. Section 4, Beyond the Headlines, the human cost of media sensationalism. While the media frenzy surrounding the Schiavo case provided fodder for countless news cycles and fueled a national debate about end-of-life care, it also came at a significant human cost. The constant media scrutiny, the relentless pursuit of sound bites and dramatic footage, and the often intrusive presence of cameras transformed a private family tragedy into a very public spectacle, subjecting those involved to intense pressure and emotional strain. For Michael Schiavo, thrust into the role of a reluctant public figure, the media attention was often unbearable. He faced accusations of greed, of callousness, of betraying his wife's memory, and his every move was scrutinized and second-guessed. The media's portrayal of him as a cold and calculating figure contrasted sharply with the loving husband he claimed to be, creating a gulf of understanding that seemed impossible to bridge. The Schindlers, while often embracing the media spotlight as a platform to advocate for their daughter's life, also endured their share of scrutiny and criticism. Their motives were questioned, their actions dissected, and their grief, while undoubtedly genuine, was often portrayed as a form of denial, of clinging to false hope in the face of overwhelming medical evidence. Beyond the immediate family, the media frenzy surrounding the Schiavo case had a ripple effect, impacting the lives of countless others. Medical professionals involved in Terri's care found themselves thrust into the spotlight, their expertise questioned, their motives scrutinized. Politicians, eager to capitalize on the case's emotional resonance, often exploited the tragedy for their own gain, further polarizing the debate and hindering meaningful dialogue. Section 5, A Nation Divided, the Schiavo case and the polarization of American society. The Terri Schiavo case highlighted deep cultural and political divisions in America, exposing fault lines on life and death, government roles, and individual rights. It became a battleground for competing worldviews, with debates often breaking down along ideological lines. The media's framing of the case in binary terms exacerbated polarization, overshadowing nuanced ethical and legal issues. The Schiavo case underscored the need for respectful dialogue and clear mechanisms for end-of-life decision-making. In 2005, the legal battle over Terri Schiavo's fate concluded, affirming Michael Schiavo's right to make end-of-life decisions. The courts upheld individual autonomy and surrogate decision-making, rejecting the Schindler's appeals. Federal courts, including the Supreme Court, declined to intervene, emphasizing judicial restraint. The nation remained divided, reflecting deep beliefs about life, death, and government roles. The Terri Schiavo case reaffirmed the right of competent adults to refuse medical treatment, even life-sustaining treatment. This right is rooted in individual autonomy and bodily integrity, protecting personal liberty. The 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause includes a right to privacy, encompassing end-of-life care. The common law principle of informed consent supports this autonomy. State laws, including Florida's, codify the right to refuse treatment. Advance directives ensure individuals' wishes are respected when they can't speak for themselves. The Terri Schiavo case highlighted the importance of advance care planning. States revisited laws to strengthen advance directives, ensuring end-of-life wishes are respected. Advance directives, like living wills and durable powers of attorney, empower individuals to specify their medical treatment preferences. States simplified these documents and promoted public awareness, making them more accessible and user-friendly. Advance directives ensure end-of-life care aligns with individual preferences, minimizing conflict and supporting families. The Terri Schiavo case highlighted the debate over judicial activism, the role of courts, and the balance of power in a democracy. Critics argued courts overstepped, legalizing euthanasia and imposing values on society. Courts, however, focused on interpreting law, not making policy. They concluded Michael Schiavo had the authority to decide based on legal precedents and evidence. The Terri Schiavo case cast a long shadow on American law, ethics, and public policy. It revealed deeply held beliefs about life, faith, and government's role in intimate human experiences. The case highlighted the tension between individual autonomy and the sanctity of life. It underscored the limits of law in addressing emotional, spiritual, and psychological dimensions of end-of-life care. The Schiavo case is a call for empathy, understanding, and ongoing dialogue. The Terri Schiavo case continues to resonate deeply within American jurisprudence, medical ethics, and end-of-life care. It stands as a reminder of the complexities when personal decisions intersect with legal battles and public opinion. The case prompted a re-evaluation of laws and sparked a national conversation about advanced care planning. It reaffirmed the right of competent adults to refuse medical treatment. The Schiavo case brought this issue to the forefront of public consciousness. It highlighted the personal nature of refusing treatment amidst profound suffering. The case underscored the critical role of surrogate decision-making in end-of-life care. It emphasized the need for clear legal mechanisms to guide surrogate decision-making. The case prompted legislative action to re-examine laws on advanced directives. It highlighted the importance of documenting end-of-life wishes to avoid burdening family members. Advanced directives ensure that an individual's medical wishes are honored, even if they can't communicate. The Schiavo case highlighted the need for clear end-of-life plans to avoid family disputes and ensure dignified care. The Terri Schiavo case was a defining moment in the national conversation about end-of-life care. It highlighted the importance of individual autonomy and the role of medical technology in prolonging life. Palliative care focuses on providing relief from symptoms and stress, improving quality of life. Hospice care, for those with a life expectancy of 6 months or less, emphasizes comfort and support. Both approaches offer a compassionate, holistic way to manage end-of-life care. The Terri Schiavo case highlighted the limits of law in resolving personal, moral, and medical complexities. Courts upheld laws but couldn't bridge moral divides. Compassion and empathy are crucial in these situations. Community support is invaluable for end-of-life care. Palliative care and support groups offer essential guidance. The Terri Schiavo case continues to spark reflection and discussion in a rapidly changing world. The ethical and legal questions at the heart of the case remain as relevant as ever, prompting ongoing debate about the meaning of life and the role of technology. The Schiavo case serves as a timeless reminder of the complexities of end-of-life decision-making. Advancements in medical technology have further blurred the lines between life and death, raising new ethical dilemmas. The development of life-sustaining technologies has made it possible to prolong life in ways unimaginable just a few decades ago. These advancements raise profound questions about the limits of medical intervention and the definition of death. The Schiavo case highlighted the emotional and ethical complexities of withdrawing life-sustaining treatment. The case sparked a national conversation about the nature of consciousness and the moral implications of allowing someone to die. These questions continue to be debated in courtrooms, legislative chambers, and living rooms across the country. The Schiavo case, though now a part of history, continues to serve as a catalyst for reflection and discussion. It is a story that transcends its time and place, reminding us of the enduring power of love and the importance of honoring individual autonomy.